last year, I think it was last year, in Lehigh Acres, which was very close to where we used to live in Florida, police were called to a home at 2 a.m. in the morning. It turns out there were two cousins in the home who had gotten into an altercation. It started off first with punching, and then one of the men took a knife out and cut his cousin. Now, we hear stories like this all the time, people getting in fights, people hurting each other. But what was unique about this particular instance was what caused the fight. The fight started over almond milk. Now, here's what the police determined happened. One of the cousins said almond milk was better than whole milk. The other cousin disagreed, and he thought whole milk was better than almond milk. So this caused a physical fight. This caused one to take out a knife and stab his cousin. Now, isn't that crazy? Isn't it crazy the things that people fight about? And it's even worse when it's family. Now, you don't have to answer, but have you ever been in a conflict with someone in your family? It's not pleasant. In fact, it stinks. And we all know a story of family members not talking to each other for years and years and years, and many times it's over something that wasn't that big of a deal. That conflict can cause so much hurt, so much damage, it can cause so much destruction in our lives if we let it. Today we're going to talk about two brothers who have a huge conflict with each other that threatens to destroy the family, that threatens the covenant promises of God. We have been looking at Genesis, and we've been focusing on, lately, the covenant promises that God made to Abraham, and how each generation that comes from Abraham on, each generation faces threats to the covenant promises. Something happens that if it was just left up to man, if God was not involved, the covenant promises could be destroyed. We saw in Abraham and Sarah, the problem was Sarah couldn't have kids. And so the covenant couldn't be fulfilled if there were no kids to carry on the covenant. And we saw how God miraculously took care of that problem, and He resolved the issue, and He fulfilled His promise to Abraham and Sarah. Then came Isaac. And Isaac, his problem was he couldn't find a wife. All of the women in the world, in the nations around him, were idol worshippers, and they were not a good fit to be a part of the covenant that God had made. So they had to go and find a wife for Isaac, and so they found a wife in Rebekah, which once again God miraculously brought together. He weaved all the pieces so that everything worked out according to His plan. And once again, the promises of the covenant were fulfilled in Isaac and Rebekah. Last week we saw about Jacob and Esau. And how what we're seeing is a family that is divided. A family that is against, parts of the family are against each other. Esau was born first, but he is not the one who was going to receive the promises. Rebekah had been told through the Lord that the younger would rule over the older, and that the nations, that her children would become two nations, and that they would be divided against each other. And today we're going to see how that happens. And each step along the way, we are going to see how the covenant promises of God are threatened, not because God is not faithful to His word, but because people are so full of sin and so selfish, and people get in the way of the promises of God. And I think as we look at this, I hope that we can look at our lives and see God's faithfulness. But I hope that we learn that even when we are faithless, God is faithful. Even when our life is full of sin, even when we cause conflict with those around us, even though when we are not godly, we know that God is faithful to His Word. So turn with me in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 27. Genesis chapter 27. Some time has passed from what we looked at last week. We saw as we left that Isaac loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob. We saw that Jacob tricked, manipulated his brother Esau for the birthright. He used a situation for his own advantage, and instead of looking after the welfare of his brother, he tried to get the birthright for himself, and he did. And so now we pick up later on, look at chapter 27, verse 1. It says, when Isaac was old, and his eyes were dim so that he could not see, he called Esau his older son and said to him, my son, and he answered, here I am. He said, behold, I am old. I do not know the day of my death. Now then, take your weapon, your quiver and your bow, and go out to the field and hunt game for me. And prepare for me delicious food, such as I love, and bring it to me so that I may eat, that my soul may bless you before I die. So Isaac is old, and the thought turns to the next generation. When Isaac looks at what's to come, his intention is to pass the blessing on to Esau. The problem is that was not God's plan. The problem is God had already foretold through Rebekah that the younger would be the one who receives the blessing. Jacob would receive the blessing. And you'll notice in this entire passage, nobody seeks the will of God. Nobody seeks out God to find out what to do next. We don't see Isaac praying and imploring God to reveal His will. We don't see Rebekah, we don't see Esau or Jacob, any of them seeking after God's will in this situation. And in fact, I think what we're going to see is everybody acts selfishly, everybody acts in their own interests, and nobody seeks God's will. What we see here is a family that is not living what you would expect for how God's people should live. They are not doing what you would expect them to do in service and to follow after God. They all have their own agenda, and they're all doing things their way. Now, we know to some degree that Rebekah was right, that Jacob was the one to receive the blessing, but that doesn't excuse what she did. And it starts with Isaac seemingly ignoring what God had already foretold. Isaac, because he loved Esau, wanted to pass the blessing on to Esau, and it didn't really matter to him, it seems, what God wanted. And it's interesting, notice how it talks about him focusing on food, which kind of relates to how Esau was. Remember last week how food was kind of Esau's downfall? And here Isaac is preparing the blessing. He says, but before, go get me some food. Go get some game. Go hunting. Bring me back some delicious food before I bless you. And it's almost like this picture, like Esau and Isaac, in this, at least in this situation, seem to be focused on the flesh instead of on God and what He wants. So far, Isaac, the patriarch, a man of faith. We know he's a man of faith. And as I talk about this chapter, understand it's not that these people don't love God and they're not people of faith. It's that sometimes they're human like us, they're sinful like us, They're selfish like us. And when they live in the flesh, we're going to see the destruction that comes from living in the flesh. So Isaac sets out. Esau sets out to go hunting. Esau is determined to get the blessing. He thinks it's his. He thinks he deserves it. It's his right. But Rebekah has other plans. Look at verse 5. Now Rebekah was listening when Isaac spoke to his son Esau. So when Esau went to the field to hunt for game and bring it, Rebekah said to her son Jacob, I heard your brother speak to your brother Esau. I heard your father speak to your brother Esau. Bring me game and prepare for me delicious food that I may eat it and bless you before the Lord before I die. Now therefore, my son, obey my voice as I command you. Go to the flock and bring me 2 good young goats, so that I may prepare from them delicious food for your father, such as he loves. And you shall bring it to your father to eat, so that he may bless you before he dies. But Jacob said to Rebekah his mother, Behold, my brother Esau is a hairy man, and I am a smooth man. Perhaps my father will feel me, and I shall seem to be mocking him, and bring a curse upon myself and not a blessing. His mother said to him, Let your curse be on me, my son. Only obey my voice, and go bring that to me. Rebekah has very different plans than her husband Isaac. What we often talk about how Jacob and Esau brothers were divided, but the truth is throughout the story, throughout the narrative, it's not just them who are divided. Isaac and Rebekah are divided. And this causes Rebekah to do something that is deceptive, cruel, to take advantage of her husband's eyesight so that she doesn't know what he's doing, to play on the things that she knows about her husband. He loves a certain kind of food, she can make it for him. They're even planning down to putting hair on Jacob's arm so he'll feel more like Esau, because Esau was a hairy man. We see a family that is in complete disarray when we think about it. Isaac and Rebekah have 2 different plans, and they are both determined that they're going to get their way. And Rebekah here is willing to do anything in order for Jacob, her favorite, to receive the blessing. So she asks or commands her son to lie, cheat, and steal. This isn't really a picture of a godly family, right? When we look at this picture, this is not a poster of a good, godly, righteous family at this point. Thankfully, this is just a snapshot of their life. Right? This isn't it all. And if we took all of us at our worst, I'm sure it wouldn't look very good for everyone to see. Right? But this is not a picture of godliness, of faithfulness, of obedience. We see a family in disarray. We see a family of competition and lying and deception and manipulation. And so as it plays out, Jacob obeys his mother. Rebekah prepares food. Jacob takes the garments of Esau and he puts the skins on his arms so to trick his father. And then he takes this meal, dressed up like his brother, to his father. Verse 18 says, So he went into his father and said, My father. And he said, Here I am. Who are you, my son? Now this is an important question. Isaac is asking his son, Who are you? Now, in order to receive the blessing, Jacob has to lie. In order to receive the blessing from his father, Jacob has to deceive and pretend that he is someone else. Now, we are not there yet, but we're going to see that later on in the story, when Jacob comes face to face with God, God asks him this question. He asks him, who are you? What is your name? And I think it's directly related to this because it's tied to a blessing. Jacob was willing to do anything to receive the blessing of his father. But the truth was, the blessing of his father was not the blessing that mattered. The only blessing that mattered was the blessing of God. And he was willing to lie and deceive his earthly father, but he could not deceive God. And we see throughout Jacob's life that not only in this situation, but in the situations that follow, he lies and manipulates and tries to control the situation for his benefit. And sometimes it works, but a lot of times it doesn't. And although he can sometimes manipulate people, there is going to come a time when he comes face to face with God, and he cannot manipulate God. So this is pointing forward to something that's coming. But here the question of his father is, who are you? And notice in verse 19, Jacob said, I am Esau, your firstborn. We see Jacob the liar, the deceiver, the trickster. Jacob, who's crooked and manipulative. And how is God going to bless this person? I mean, this is the struggle of this passage. How is God going to bless this family? This family is messed up. Jacob is not a good guy. How is God going to be faithful to this family? Let's look on. Jacob lies. He says that he's Esau. Isaac is a little, he might not be able to see, but he senses something's up, right? He's like, wait, how did you catch the food so quickly, And Jacob says, well, the Lord granted me success, and Isaac still, isn't quite sure, so he wants to touch Jacob, and hence the skin that maybe tricked Isaac into thinking he was Esau. And he even says, you sound like Jacob. You don't sound like your brother Esau. So Isaac senses that something's wrong. And what it really is an opportunity for Isaac or Jacob to come clean. Right? I almost think about the denials of Peter in the New Testament, where he had 3 opportunities, right? It was one after the other, to take a stand for Christ and say, yes, I'm a disciple. But here it's kind of the opposite, where Jacob has the opportunity to tell the truth. And each time, he chooses to lie instead of telling the truth. He lies over and over again. We get then to verse 23. And he said he did not recognize him because his hands were hairy like his brother's Esau. So he blessed him. But notice after the blessing he said, are you really my son Esau? Another opportunity to tell the truth after the blessing. And Jacob lies again. He answered, I am. Jacob lied over and over again to receive the blessing of his father. And we see that the blessing was significant. As we look on down to verse 26, it said, then his father Isaac said to him, come near and kiss me, my son. So he came near and kissed him. And Isaac smelled the smell of his garments and blessed him and said, see, the smell of my son is as the smell of a field that the Lord has blessed. May God give you the dew of heaven and the fatness of the earth and the plenty of grain and wine. Let people serve you and nations bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may your mother's son bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be everyone who blesses you. In the beginning of this passage, we truly see a family divided. Isaac and Rebekah are at odds with each other. They have a different plan. It is full of dysfunction. And I want to be clear, I don't think anybody does the right thing in this passage at all. Nobody is doing the right thing. Everybody is even though Rebekah, I think, had the right end, she knew what God wanted, she didn't do it God's way. She tried to manipulate the situation by herself. And I've already mentioned, nobody is seeking after God. Nobody is calling out to God. They are all in their own strength and in their own power trying to get what they want. And at the end, where we just left off, it appears that Jacob gets what he wants. It appears he gets the blessing. But we're going to see that although he gets his father's blessing, because of the lies and the deception, there's a path of destruction that follows after Jacob. And that's true in life, right? We know that you can lie about something for a while, but usually those things come to light. There was a story of a couple in Florida who were planning their wedding. They had big plans. They had selected their venue, had a swimming pool, a waterfall, a hot tub, sauna, tennis courts, gazebo, a bowling alley. They invited all of their friends to come on a Saturday to come have this awesome wedding at this awesome venue. And everyone gets there that day. And it turns out they didn't have permission to be there. Here's what had happened. For this couple had been to this property, and the owner wasn't there at the time, and they didn't think the owner was living there, so they just decided, we're going to plan our wedding. The owner doesn't live there. They're not even going to know. We're going to invite everybody. We're going to have our wedding here, and nobody will know anything about it. The unfortunate thing was the owner wasn't living in the house, but he was living next door in another house. And he saw all these people coming out. He's like, what's going on? So he went out there and talked to them, and they told him there's a wedding happening here. He's like, oh, I know there's not. And can you imagine, like, the embarrassment, right? All of your friends, all your family coming to this, and then you get turned away because you lied. Because you didn't do the right thing. Because you didn't tell the truth. We see that happen over and over and over again. And we're going to see in this family that the lying, the deceiving, tears this family apart. And although Jacob gets what he wants, he loses so much. It tells us in verse 30, after Isaac blessed Jacob, that, of course, his brother finally comes home from the field. We knew this would happen, right? Jacob had to know this was coming. Rebekah had to know this was coming. So Esau comes home. He prepared food. He brought it to his father. He went in expecting to receive the blessing. And look at verse 32. His father Isaac said to him, who are you? The same question he asked Jacob, by the way. Esau really is the only one who's honest, in this situation. He's like, yes, it's me. It's Esau. I'm your firstborn son. Look at verse 33. Then Isaac trembled very violently. What do you think Isaac was going through in this point? His own wife and son lied to him and deceived him. He was angry, hurt, and it shows his physical response was trembling violently when he heard what was going on. He said, who was it then that hunted game and brought it to me, and I ate it all before you came, and I have blessed him? Yes, and he shall be blessed. Isaac is hurt by what has happened. Isaac is angry by what has happened. But look at Esau. Look at Esau. Verse 34, as soon as Esau heard the words of his father, he cried out with an exceedingly great and bitter cry, and said to his father, bless me, even me also, my father. But he said, your brother came deceitfully and has taken away your blessing. Esau said, is he not rightly called Jacob? For he has cheated me these 2 times. He took away my birthright, and behold, now he has taken away my blessing. He then said, have you not reserved a blessing for me? Isaac answered and said to Esau, behold, I have made him lord over you, and all your brothers I have given to him for servants, and with grain and wine I have sustained him. What then can I do for you, my son? Esau said to his father, have you but one blessing, my father? Bless me, even me also, O my father. And Esau lifted up his voice and wept. We often don't focus on Esau in this whole narrative. We think about Jacob because he's a patriarch. And sometimes we could say, oh, the ends justify the means, but look at what happened here to Esau. You see a man who is crying, weeping, pleading with his father for a blessing, knowing that his brother cheated and lied and deceived to take this away from him. And we know that God had this blessing intended for Jacob to begin with. But look at the hurt and the pain, the way they did it brought to Esau. And you can understand it. The pain that he must be feeling. Pleading with the blessing over and over, saying, well, Father, don't you have something? Don't you have some blessing for me? And his father has a blessing, but it only makes things worse. Look at verse 39. Then Isaac, his father, answered and said to him, behold, away from the fatness of the earth shall be your dwelling, and away from the dew of heaven on high. By the sword you shall live, and you shall serve your brother. But when you grow restless, you shall break his yoke from your neck. Isaac says, you're not going to have the best land. You're going to live by the sword. Your life, your descendants will live by conflict and war. And your brother's going to rule over you. When we look at verse 41, in some ways we can understand it. It says, now Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing with which his father had blessed him. And Esau said to himself, the days of mourning for my father are approaching. Then I will kill my brother Jacob. I think Esau is looking at it this way. Jacob stole it from me. I'm going to take it back. He's saying, I'm not going to do this while my father's alive. I'm going to let my father die in peace. But then I'm going to kill my brother and take all that he has stolen from me. This family has been destroyed. This relationship between Jacob and Esau, it would appear at this point, is permanently destroyed. And we could expect that. But thankfully, the story's not over here. But right now, in the life of this family, things are a mess. And in verse 42 it says, but the words of Esau, her older son, were told to Rebekah. So she sent and called Jacob, her younger son, and said to him, behold, your brother Esau comforts himself about you by planning to kill you. So basically, Rebekah's saying, listen, the only way that Esau is having comfort from this is because he's planning to kill you. He's planning revenge, and that is giving him comfort through what has happened. rise, flee to Laban, my brother, and Aaron, and stay with him a while, until your brother's fury turns away, until your brother's anger turns away from you, and he forgets what you have done to him. Then I will send you and bring you from here. Why should I bear it to both in one day, both of you in one day? So, once again, Rebekah has a plan. And the plan is to send Jacob away from the promised land. If you were with us a few weeks ago, remember Abraham when he was trying to find a wife for Isaac? He said, go find a wife, but don't let Isaac leave the promised land. Don't make him go back there. Because to leave the promised land would to go to a place that was outside of the blessing in his mind. To go back to where he was before would almost be like forsaking the promises. Because God said, I have given you this land, I have given you this place to your descendants. And now the very thing that Abraham feared for Isaac, Jacob is finding himself having to leave the promised land. And as I've mentioned, all of these things are just about the conflicts that come up and the covenant that is threatened by man's sin. And that's really what we're seeing. We're seeing the sin of this family threaten the promises of God. And how will God fulfill his promises when the people that he's made his promises to are sinful, they're wicked, they're selfish, they're liars, they're deceivers? How will God fulfill his promises to these people? And that's really the question. We see the destruction of sin in the life of this family. And we're left with the question, how is God going to fix this? And I can tell you something. As I read this passage, as I read this whole story of really Jacob's life, I see how God is able to take what we break. He's able to take the relationships that we destroy. He is able to take us, even though we're sinful, even though we're wicked, even though we're destructive, and everything we touch, we destroy as sinful human beings, that God is able to take us and help us to grow. And He is faithful to His promises, even when we do everything in our power to mess things up. That's true in the life of Jacob, and it's true for us today. When we fail, God doesn't. When we fall, God doesn't forsake us. Amen. When we are like this family who did everything in their own power and they messed everything up, because at the end of this story, we're going to see next week as Brian talks about what happens, the family is torn apart, literally. They're torn apart. And we don't exactly know the whole story, because we don't know exactly when Rebekah dies. But it's possible that Jacob never sees his mom again after this whole encounter. We don't hear her at all anymore. And if she survived, it's over 20 years from the time Jacob leaves till he comes back. Sin is destructive. Lying and deceit are destructive. But God is able to overcome. God is faithful to His covenant to this family who didn't deserve it, who didn't live up to it, and He's faithful to us. In the covenant that we live in, under, bought by the blood of Christ, we didn't earn any of it. And sometimes we do our best, right? Just like this family, to mess things up. But God is able to take our mess make something beautiful from it. He's able to take our brokenness and He's able to put things back together. And there is always a cost for sin. I mean, don't get me wrong. This family suffers greatly because of their sin. But God is able, through the years, through the experiences, through Jacob's life, where He teaches Jacob that he can't lie and deceive his way through life. He can't lie and deceive to God. God knows everything. And eventually he's going to learn that he cannot trust in himself, but the only thing he has is to hold on to God and not let go. We find ourselves in that same exact scenario. Maybe we're like Jacob and we're fighting. We're resisting. We're trying to do things in our own strength. God is patient. God is good. And He will, just like He did with Jacob, teach us, come alongside of us. But one thing He will never do, He will never abandon us or abandon His promises. Let's pray. Lord, I thank You for this morning. I thank You for this passage where we see a family, an upheaval, a family that is just going through this horrible, horrible experience. And although we see their sin and their selfishness, I pray that You will help us through the rest of the story see Your faithfulness. And I pray that in all of our lives, even though we mess things up just like Jacob and Esau, Rebekah